Employment Law class, you will look at Unit 3, the contract of employment and employer and employee relationship. Specifically, we will deal with Section 1, where there was the meaning and the nature of contract of employment. Session objectives. By the end of this session, you should be able to define and explain what is meant by contract of employment, identify the terms of contract of employment, differentiate between the contract of service and contract for service. What is the meaning of contract of employment? Basically, we are saying that with contract of employment, it's either an oral or written or express or implied agreement that specify the terms and conditions under which a person consents to perform certain duties as directed and controlled by the employer in return for agreed wage or salary. Here it simply means that when we are talking about contract of employment, then here we have one person, let's say A, being the employee, B being the employer. So these two people will enter into an agreement that B being the employer is going to provide work and A being the employee is going to perform those work. The work that A is going to perform, A will be directed and controlled by B. In that case, because A has consented or agreed to perform the work for B, which is the employer, A in return must receive wage or salary. In other words, remuneration. So it means that the service being provided by A to B, which is the employer, is in return of the wage or the salary or remuneration A is receiving from B. Remember that for there to be a contract of employment, it is the duty of the employer to provide the tools that is needed by the employee to work. The manner in which the work should be done is controlled by the employer. So in this case, the duties of the employer, the duties of the employee is being controlled and directed by the employer. So as the employee has agreed to perform the work, he will do so on the instruction of the employer. Now, once a contract of employment has been established, both the employer and employee owns a duty of mutuality and confidence. So there should be a confidence and trust as we discussed in our previous class, and to make only lawful and reasonable demand. As an employee, you only make reasonable demands. You don't have to make unnecessary demands. The demands that you will make, it should be lawful and it should be reasonable. This is not only on the employee, it is also on the employer. As an employer, demand what is lawful from the employee. Don't make the employer overwork. Terms of the contract of employment. In contract of employment, we have express terms and implied terms. Express terms are the terms that express terms are terms that have been specifically stated in the contract of an employment agreement. So you'll be talking about pay. How much is the person going to be paid? You talk about the hours in which the person is going to work. You talk about notice of termination, issues on holidays, and among others. You remember when we were dealing with written contract, we indicated that under the first schedule of the Labor Act 2003 Act 651, the written agreement should contain certain elements, and most of them are express. So you write anything that you want to, any condition or term that you want it to be known to the party, you bring all those elements there. There are a lot of express terms that the parties may agree or the employer would like to bring it forward or put it make it part of the contract. We also have implied terms. Sometimes there are certain terms that the employer and the employee will not agree on, or it will not come in contemplation to put in the contract. The law still applies. So you have implied by custom and usage. Custom and usage simply means that in a particular trade, there's a particular thing that they normally do. So whether you accept or you put in the agreement or you don't put in the agreement, it is still applicable. Now, it can also be applied by statute. Sometimes you not put in your agreement, but the statute requires that as an employee, you have to do ABC. As an employer, you have to perform this obligation. Let's try to interpret or explain some of the key terms as far as contract of employment is concerned. Section 175 of the Labor Act provides the following. When we talk about employment, we mean employment under a contract of employment or agreement of employment. A contract of employment means a contract of service, which is a contract of service whether express or implied, and if expressed, whether oral or in writing. So the Labor Act gives its own definition. So a contract of employment means a contract of service, whether expressed or implied, and if it is expressed, is it oral or it is in writing. Now, contract of service here, the employer is going to provide the tools that are needed by the employee to perform the work. The employee will be controlled and directed by the employer as how he or she should perform his work. The Act also defines who a worker. Worker means a person employed under a contract of. So here there's a missing word. There's a missing word, which is contract. So there's R here. A worker means a person employed under a contract of employment, whether continuous or part-time, temporary or casual basis. So that's what the Act defines as a worker. An employer too means that any person who employs a worker under a contract of employment. So here you're talking about the appointing authority. The appointing authority. The person as used here could be artificial person or natural person. Natural person means that maybe Kofi Mensah, Amata has employed another person. Artificial person, you're looking at organizations, companies, and other institutions. Now let's deal with the differences between contract of employment and contract for service. Contract of service. With that one, there's an employer-employee relationship in existence. Usually a continuous relationship. It is not one time. With contract of service, there's a duty of care owned by the employer to the employee. Also, employer is generally liable for the vicarious act of employees. When you talk about the vicarious liability, we mean that the employer will be held liable for the tort committed by his employee in the course of business when the employee acts within the course of the scope of his business. Now let's take this for instance. A being the employer, B being the employee, C being a third party. A has employed B as a driver. The duty of B being the employee is to take goods from Kumasi to Accra every day. Assuming that at a point in time, if B sending those goods to Accra, B hits or knocked down C on the way, but C didn't die. C has been injured. Now, C has a cause of action against B and A, jointly and severally. But the one who will be liable in case judgment is given will be A, being the employer, because he has the larger pocket, he has money. So we say that A will be vicariously liable for the conduct of B. However, assuming that B, instead of going to Accra straight from Kumasi, he passes different place when he's on a detour of his own, then A will not be responsible for the liabilities that will occur. There's a protected legislation applies to the contract, and there's a method for payment of wages. Subject of contract is to carry on continuous work. So in the case of contract of service, it's for continuous work. Now, contract for service. We have employer-independent contractor relationship as against as what the one you saw under contract of service, employer and employee relationship. Here, the individual perform his work and also take remuneration, but the employer does not control or direct the manner in which the independent contractor should carry on the work. A relationship organized around the completion of one's piece of work. There's a duty of care arising from the occupier's liability. Occupier's liability here simply means that the owner of the premises would be held responsible if the place is not put in order for the independent contractor to work. Here, and the employer is not generally liable for vicarious acts of the independent contractor. So here, because there's an independent contractor, the employer could not be held responsible for any liabilities incurred by the independent contractor. So let's use our example. A, B, C, so B. A is an employer, B is an independent contractor, C is a third party. In case B performing the work to A and incurs injury to C, C cannot bring action against A, or A will not be liable because B is an independent contractor, and therefore because he controls the way in which he does his work and the manner in which he does his work, he will be liable. So here there is no application of vicarious liability. Various methods of payment including lump sum per job. So for them, they may charge lump sum. Maybe this particular work, we are taking 10 billion. The subject of the contract is once-off job, so it's a one-time job. Now, these are the factors that distinguish contracts of employment for contracts of service. So the degree of control exercised by the employer. So in this case, if the employer controls how the employee perform his work, then it's a contract of employment. If the employer does not control the way in which the employee does his work, then it is contract for service. We have organizational test. Organizational test, if the work that the employee is performing is integral to the activity of the company, then it is contract of service. If it is not integral to the business of the company, then it is contract for service. You also have provision of equipment. Now, in contract of service, it is the employer who provide those equipment or the material needed for work. However, in contract for service, it is the employer, it is the independent contractor himself that provide his own tools. The incidence of payment of tax and social security. For contract of service, the employer deduct taxes from the employee and pay to the government. Also, the employee pays social security. Now, with contract for service, these taxes and social security is paid by the independent contractor himself. The extent of obligation to work or to employ. We also have the traditional structure of trade or profession concern and the arrangement within it. By way of summary, this session we have looked at the meaning and definition of contract of employment. It further explored the terms associated with the contract of employment, and we distinguish between contract of service and contract for service as it relates to employment contract.